The views and opinions expressed here on Wrestling Winedown are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. What's up, guys? It's Lo, and you are tuned in to Wrestling Winedown, a female-founded and hosted podcast dedicated to professional wrestling and our favorite adult beverage. We are back with our third installment of The Life of a Wrestling Fan, our newest series here on Wrestling Winedown, where we chat with amazing individuals with awesome careers who also happen to be professional wrestling fans. On this episode, I am joined by Ben Morse. Ben formerly served as the Director of Digital Media at Marvel. You can now find him sharing his knowledge and expertise with journalism students at my alma mater, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Go Rebels. On this episode, Ben spills the wine on attaining his dream job at Marvel, including the amazing experiences and people he met at the company and how he was able to intertwine his love of wrestling with his job. If you aren't following Ben on Twitter, he shares his awesome photos that he's taken with wrestlers over the years on a regular basis. 10 out of 10 if you're a wrestling fan. Ben also spills the wine on how he transitioned to teaching, his popular podcasting class that he teaches at UNLV, and what advice he would give to individuals looking to start a podcast. So grab your glass of wine. We're going in for the 3 count. I am joined by Ben Morse, who is a professional wrestling fan. He has worked at Marvel. He is also a professor at UNLV, and he is also a new dad to a second child, a son this time. So hopefully he's a wrestling fan, right? How are you, Ben?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Yeah, things are crazy over here. Thanks for having me on the show again. My son is about 6 weeks old. My daughter is turning 5 next week. They both, I will say this, my wife does the overnight shift because obviously she needs to. And so in the mornings, what I like to do, particularly now because we're on summer vacation, is I don't really need to get up. I'm not teaching currently. I'm just doing work during the day. So I will get up with the kids at about whenever they get up and then hang out with them till like noon. And every day it's wrestling. Like that's what we're doing. We're watching old wrestling. Like right now with my daughter for years and years, I went through all the nitros. So she got through all of those. Now we're back. I'm in like 98 for Raw. I'm watching Raw. I'm watching Heat, which I didn't watch a lot of the first time around. And then we'll throw pay-per-views on. It's funny. I was just watching Evolution.
Oh yeah.
Yesterday and today. And I had my daughter sitting in the background. She's like, "Oh, cool, the girls." So she gets to say. So yeah, they don't have a choice. They will be wrestling fans whether they like to or not. Sometimes my daughter will get fed up and just go, "Daddy, no more wrestling this morning." And I'm like, "Okay, fair enough. We'll take a break. We'll watch something else."
Let's take it back to the beginning of your fandom. When did you become a professional wrestling fan?
The first memories I have of professional wrestling. So I was born in '82. I don't think I started watching regularly till like 1990. I really vividly remember SummerSlam 1990, the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich, beating Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental title. That's like my foundational wrestling memory. And then I remember my dad getting us Survivor Series 1990 on Thanksgiving and getting to watch that, which had the best Survivor Series team of all time, the Warriors, with the Ultimate Warrior, Texas Tornado, and the Legion of Doom, which I thought was amazing. But from there, it was just like, I was always a fan. I think it was interesting. I think my dad was like a casual fan. Like he had definitely like his dad had taken him to Boston Garden to see, he always talked about seeing like Antonino Rocca and older wrestlers, never mentioned Bruno. So I don't think he was like a Bruno guy, but like talked about them, talked about Bobo Brazil. I think my dad was a casual fan. And he's like, "Oh, cool, this is something I can share with my son." And then very quickly it became evident that I was going to be a much bigger fan than him. Like I got super into it. It was like everything, like comics and wrestling were my life. So I think he was like, "Okay, you do your thing. It's not going to be our thing together. It's going to be kind of your thing." But he, would occasionally, I definitely had fun. Like he would come down and watch SmackDown with me and stuff. But yeah, so about 1990 was when I got started.
What has kept you interested as a fan? I know a lot of people, they have that time in their lives where they kind of like fall out. They don't watch wrestling, whether it's in high school or
Yeah.
college or adult life. But have you ever fell out, A? And if you have, what has brought you back in? And if you haven't, what has kept you interested for so long?
I think I've pretty much always been in. When the product gets bad, the only difference is, and the big thing that has like kept me going is that it's such a communal thing. Like I always am able to find friends who are into it. And like that was the type of thing where it was like when I was a kid, I watched it with my dad. Then when I was a little bit older, if I felt that at all, it was when I was like later in elementary school, like going into middle school, just because I had no one to watch with. But then the minute I got to high school, like all my friends were like, I was in high school, like peak Monday Night Wars era, like Austin McMahon, NWO, like wrestling was cool. So all my friends in high school watched with me and we would just like go over to each other's houses, have a good time with it. Then in college, I became friends with like my closest group of friends in college. And again, the two things that kind of like we were into was they all like comics and they all like wrestling. So we all watch wrestling, we would go to shows, do all that. Then during the years I was at Wizard and then I was at Marvel, there was a lot of wrestling fans there on staff, like Ryan Panagos, who was like my good buddy and my boss at Marvel for all 10 years I was there. We were huge wrestling fans and we would use the Marvel name to get as much cool wrestling stuff as we could. Like I think I've probably told you in the past, like we literally got Marvel Studios to bankroll us on a trip to WrestleMania 30.
I did not know this. No.
So me and Ryan are sitting around one day and we go, wow, WrestleMania 30 is coming up. It's in New Orleans. His wife was from New Orleans. So it would be like, if we could get the two of us, our friend Blake and his wife could take a trip down there. She could see her family. We could go to WrestleMania. It'd be great. But we didn't want to pay for anything. So we went to Marvel proper and we were like, hey, will you send us to WrestleMania in New Orleans so we can like get interviews with wrestlers and stuff? And they're like, no, we're not interested. So then Ryan goes to Marvel Studios. And this was right around when Captain America Civil War was coming out. So you had Cap people and Iron Man people. And we're like, let's go down to, I think it was Civil War. It was either Civil War or Winter Soldier. It was one of the Captain America movies. But basically, we said to Marvel Studios, we're like, send us down to WrestleMania. We'll interview a bunch of people about Captain America movies. It'll be great. You'll have tons of content. And they went for it. I do not know why. Like, so we went to New Orleans, stayed in like a decent hotel that a lot of the wrestlers were at, and just like chilled in New Orleans for like a week on Marvel Studios dime. It was amazing. And then we got them to do the same thing for WrestleMania 32 in Dallas. I skipped a year.
Oh my goodness!
I didn't go to 31 in California, so I skipped a year in between. But we went to 30 and we went to 32, and we had been to 29 because it was in New York. So we had just gone there. We just paid. But yeah, so that's a tangent. But basically, what keeps me in wrestling is the relationships, whether it's my friends, my coworkers, even now, like there's a lot of like, as you're a perfect example, I have a lot of students who like wrestling. So that'll keep me going because I'll go into class on Monday and be like, hey, did you watch, AEW this weekend, and have conversations with them. So I think if I ever reach a point that no one else is watching and it's just me, like hopefully at that point, that's when my kids will kick in and they'll start watching.
Right.
As long as I have someone to watch and discuss with, it's the social aspect of wrestling I really like. I mean, I could say on another level, like it's the soap opera stuff, it's the good and evil. As a comic book fan, that's a lot of like crossover for me. But really, I've always found wrestling to be like very much a social construct. It's something that I can share with other people, be it friends, coworkers, students, et cetera. And it's like, it's something we have in common that we can discuss. So I think that's what's kept me going. That's kind of a weird answer, but I think that makes sense.
No, I think it's a good answer. And it's one that I haven't heard before, but it makes perfect sense. You're really able to discuss wrestling anywhere with anyone that really likes it. Definitely makes sense. Let's dive into your amazing career.
Sure.
You worked at Marvel Entertainment for 10 years, where you served in a variety of positions specializing in new and digital media, as well as the editorial director of new media.
Mhm.
What interested you about working at Marvel?
When I was a kid, I wanted to work at Marvel. I tell everyone this story is that I had a assignment. I think it was fourth grade or fifth grade. All right. So fifth grade, we all had an assignment. We had to write a letter to ourselves from the future. Mm-hmm. It had to be like, this is what you grew up and ended up doing. I lived in like a Boston suburb. All my friends wanted to be lawyers or like real estate agents because that's what their parents were. But I was like, and the funny thing was like all the letters were like, I'm a successful lawyer. I'm also in the NBA, because we were kids and we didn't understand that's not how it works. It was also like a white Jewish community too. So the fact that it was producing that many NBA players was pretty hilarious. We were a bunch of like short Jewish white kids. But I wrote my letter that I was working at Marvel. It was kind of like a vague, I didn't really know what I was doing there. I was just like, hey, you work at Marvel. You help make the comics. You help do this, blah, blah, blah. And you're in the NBA, because I didn't break away from my friends like that. And what I always like to tell people is, well, I didn't make it to the NBA, but I did make it to Marvel. I was always interested in working in comics, and I went to college for journalism, got an English degree, was planning to work at a newspaper or work in a newsroom. And then the crucial turning point I always tell people about is that in between my junior and senior years of college, I interned at a local newspaper around Boston. And I didn't like it. Like I hated it. I was like, oh my God. Because I loved working on the student newspaper. But then when you got into like local news and it's like reporting on like cats getting stuck in trees and stuff like that, I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I'm like, I can't do this. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I was like, I want to do something with my writing. I want to do something journalistic, but not necessarily like newspaper. And it was my dad who I went and got lunch with my dad, and I was like, Dad, what do I do? And he said, you should, because this is the thing, this is what I tell everyone. I'm like, when you're young, you should try the thing that seems unlikely, like impossible, like the thing that you really want to do. And he's like, what are you really into? And I'm like, I don't know. And he goes, you're really into comics. You love comics, but we have hundreds of them at the house to prove it. He's like, why don't you try to do something in comics? I was like, okay. So I went out me and my friend Tim paid our own way to go out to San Diego Comic-Con in 2004, year I graduated college. And I was like, I'm going to get a job. I'm going to meet people at this Comic-Con. I'm going to get a job. And I had started a correspondence with the guy who was the writer of The Flash at DC because I had a website. That's a whole other story where I broke up with my high school girlfriend and I started a comics website. I always tell my students in class, I was like, yeah, I'm going to get back out there by starting this comic book wrestling website. But I had a comic book website, writer of The Flash, liked a review I did for one of his issues, basically said to me, he's like, if you're ever in California, let me know. And so when I went to San Diego, I hooked up with him. He introduced me to a bunch of people. A couple of the guys he introduced me to were working in a magazine called Wizard. Wizard had been like my favorite magazine when I was a kid, and on into adulthood, I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. It was a magazine all about comic books, like an entertainment weekly, but for comic books.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up getting a job at Wizard right out of college, and I became a research assistant. And then I was a staff writer. So I was writing articles, interviewing my childhood heroes. Like it was all happening.
Wow.
Then after 2.5 years at Wizard, one of my jobs at Wizard was I was the Marvel like liaison. I would talk to the people at Marvel, like, all right, what do you want in the magazine this month? And every couple of weeks I would go into New York City. I'd go to the Marvel offices, which was, again, dream come true. And I would just like visit the editors and be like, hey, what's going on in Spider-Man? What's going on in Iron Man? What's going on in Fantastic Four? And one time I was there and the guy who was running the digital media department pulled me into his office and goes, hey, how would you like to work here as opposed to Wizard? And don't get me wrong, like Wizard was amazing. And honestly, it was one of the best jobs I ever had. But like, yeah, the idea that I could work for Marvel, I was like, oh my God. So yeah, that's literally how it happened. He brought me in. I ended up being the assistant editor on the website, marvel.com. And initially, it was just about basically, writing articles, basically like running the website like as if it was a magazine and writing articles to market stuff. But actually, really interesting thing that happened was about a week after I started, this guy, John Cirilli, became my boss. He was like the senior vice president. This was John's second tour of duty at Marvel. He had been there back in the 90s, then he left, worked at Playboy for a little bit, but more relevantly, more interesting, he ended up at WWE for a bunch of years.
Wow.
So he was coming from WWE to Marvel. So I was like, this is amazing. I'm like, I'm probably annoyed at him. He knew everybody. He was in charge of, he had a lot of responsibilities having to do with the Diva search. So he helped run the Diva search. Which I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And I remember distinctly, so I started at Marvel in 2007. And I initially, honestly, it felt like not a bad fit, but it was weird. I was very used to being like big fish in the small pond at Wizard. And then suddenly you work at Marvel and you're in a corporation, you're a small piece of what's going on.
Right.
And I felt that first couple of weeks were rough. And I distinctly remember the turning point for me, what made me think, oh no, I'm going to do this and I'm going to like this, was I interviewed Edge. It was over the phone. And like my boss, John Cirilli, said like, hey, Edge is a big comic book fan. It would be cool if you interviewed him and put it on the website. And this is the first, we ended up doing tons of these. We had a series of them called Fightin' Fanboys. We would interview different wrestlers. And this was the first of those. But I had this amazing conversation with Edge for like an hour and a half. And it totally like, I've told him this, it gave me the confidence to like move forward at Marvel. So it was kind of cool. Like the wrestling stuff was always part of what I did. And I just remember that. I remember talking to Edge, and he was injured. He was coming back at Survivor Series, but we didn't know that yet. And we just had a great conversation. He loves comics. He loves the Silver Surfer and Captain America. And it was the first of many times where we realized, we're like, you know what? All us comics guys are wrestling fans, and all these wrestlers who are coming out now. I mean, probably not like old school wrestlers. They don't care about comics, but like the Edges and the CM Punks of the world were like, we love comic books. We want to be part of your world. You want to be part of ours. And it all worked out.
Wow, that's amazing. You've said that there were a lot of people at Marvel that obviously were wrestling fans. What was the percentage? Would you say it was a majority?
Not a majority. But the guys who are into it were diehard. Oh. Like it was like I definitely worked with Arun Singh and Jim Viscardi, who were the PR guys, were huge into it. Bill Roseman, who was one of the editors, who then went off to, he moved to California and became the head of Marvel Games. So the video game division, he was big into it. And like these guys were Chris Delando, who was also in PR. For some reason, the PR guys were always into wrestling, but we found each other. And, you know, we'd get together for pay-per-views, and we definitely, I remember we used to go to, big thing is we would go to ROH shows, because ROH was one of the ones that, number one, it ran in New York regularly at the Hammerstein. And number two, the very first, Edge was the first wrestler I spoke to at Marvel. The first wrestler I ever met, like for real, was Christopher Daniels at a Wizard World LA event when I was working for Wizard. To this day, like one of my good buddies actually was, I always tell the story of when I got married in 2009, I'm literally walking out of the church, going to the limo, and I get a text from Daniel saying, hey, aren't you getting married today? And then you never believe this, I'm in the hospital waiting for my son to be born. He texts me again. He goes, hey, is your son, like, was your son just born? I was like, how do you know this? So it was like, it's very funny. But Daniels would always, when Daniels in ROH, he got us tickets to ROH shows. We would go and see those. There was certainly, the way it was there was like a half dozen to a dozen diehard wrestling fans on the Marvel staff. And we loved doing stuff with each other. But then pretty much anyone at Marvel, like if we're like, hey, we're going to a wrestling show, do you want to come? It's free. Pretty much anyone's going to go.
Right.
Because they have like, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. Like, it's not like, you're not working at like a law office where people are like, no, that sounds stupid. Like if I have tickets to the ROH show, or if I have tickets to, Raw, everyone's in. So it wasn't like weird. And then also like once we started having wrestlers come into the office a lot, because we befriended the PR guys at WWE and TNA, and they would, whenever either company came to New York for a show, they would reach out to us and be like, hey, so-and-so, like he's a big fan. He wants to come in and see The Office. And he came in. And there were dozens of those. If you follow me on social media, I'm like posting random pictures I have with wrestlers all the time. All of the time. Obnoxiously so.
I was just going to get to that.
All right, we'll get to it. But yeah, I would say there was a small contingent, but very dedicated. But then everyone was pretty open to it just because there's such a crossover between comics and wrestling. I mean, wrestlers are real life superheroes. And like, that's why I think a lot of them are into comics, because they're like, oh, this is kind of like what I do. And then I think comics people are always like fascinated by wrestling. The guy who was writing Thor when I was there, Jason Aaron, who's an amazing writer, great guy, was like super into the Wyatt family. Like he's this big bearded dude from the South. So he was like, oh, I relate to this. I can see this. And so then we found out that Bray Wyatt was a big fan of him on Thor. So I connected the two of them on Twitter, and they've been friends ever since.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that was fun. But it's like you'd always, like, Jason wasn't super into wrestling. I was just like, hey, by the way, this guy is a big Thor fan. He's like, oh, let me check it out. Oh, cool. I love wrestling now. I'll become a fan moving forward.
If people follow you on Twitter, they've had the opportunity to see the different photos that you've posted, like you mentioned. How has it been to intertwine your love of wrestling with your career by meeting these wrestlers, showing them around Marvel and just being able to enjoy what they bring to the table and then them also enjoying what you bring to the table through Marvel?
It was one of my favorite aspects of the job. So you'll see in a lot of my photos, there's this bearded dude, Blake Garris. So Blake couldn't tell you what his official job title was, but he worked there about the same time I was. Blake did not care about wrestling, but Blake loved celebrities of any sort. And he was from South Carolina, Southern accent, like drawl and everything. Like living in New York for him was the coolest thing in the world, because he would like stand outside of autograph signings or shows or whatever and just try to get pictures with celebrities, actors, musicians, or whatever. He kind of became like de facto into wrestling just because he realized like this was a way to meet a bunch of famous people, which he thought was really cool. But the thing with Blake is he was a hustler. So he was out there like working the streets all the time. Like when I tell you, like, he's like, oh, the band Third Eye Blind is doing a record signing over at this place. I'm going to run over there. I'm going to give him my card. I'm going to say, do you want to come to the Marvel offices? So on any given day, like I would come in the morning and I would just be like, all right, Blake, who's coming in today? Sometimes it would be Marvel actors. Sometimes it would be wrestlers. Oftentimes it would be the most random people who Blake just happened to meet. So yeah, lead singer of Third Eye Blind, Nas, Larry Johnson, just random people. One Direction, probably the most random one. Like they just came in and I was like, hello, One Direction, let's give you a tour. But that was life at Marvel. It was just like, what famous person is going to walk over to my desk today and ask to be given a tour? It was amazing. I say to my wife all the time, like, we'll be watching TV and someone will come on a show. I'll be like, oh, I interviewed them one time. And I'm like, what a life. What a life I led, where I was just like interviewing these random people who were just like showing up. But the common thread was they all loved Marvel. And it was cool just to be able to be like to them, people from like Top Chef would come in. And I'm like, these people are amazing. And they're like, you're the Marvel guy. Like, you're amazing. Like it was a mutual admiration society. That was probably my favorite part of the job, was getting to talk with like just random people. And wrestling, because I'm such a wrestling fan, that was a big part of it for sure.
Were there any superstars that you wish you could have met while you were at Marvel that you didn't get the opportunity to meet?
Not many. We met a lot. I always said I want to meet Chris Jericho, and we never got to meet Chris Jericho. I think he would have been really fun. I've interacted with him on Twitter a couple of times, and like it seems like it would have, like, I knew he's a comics fan. It seems like a no-brainer. He was the big one. He was my white whale. But everyone else we got to meet. I mean, I met John Cena, I met The Rock, I met Shawn Michaels, never met Triple H. That would have been cool. Pretty much anyone else from like the era of coming up, like we got to meet him at some point. And like all my favorites, like Shawn Michaels is my favorite of all time. So getting to meet him was big. And he was not a comics fan, but his kids were. And so he did it for them. And I was like, whatever, this is great. But yeah, and then it was cool too. Like there were a lot of guys and girls who we met who were not necessarily, I don't know if they were necessarily like the biggest one I was coming up, but like we got to meet a lot of people from TNA who they weren't on my radar, but then they would come in and I'd meet them and like, oh, this person's so nice. I remember the guy, he's in NXT now, Rob Stone, who was Rob in TNA, came in. I had no idea who he was. I mean, I had a working knowledge of who he was, but I was like, we're not watching a ton of TNA. And he was just like the nicest dude. And I was like, all right, I'm a fan of his now. And I would watch him. And it makes wrestling more fun to watch because you're like, oh, I like that person. This is a good person.
Right.
It goes from there. But as far as people I didn't get to meet, Jericho is always the big one. Never met like Undertaker, but I was like, when was I going to meet the Undertaker? Although he was on the This Week in Marvel podcast with Ryan 2 years after I left. Because I was like, after, you know how Undertaker basically went through his like, I'm like shedding the character and giving interviews to everyone phase. Of course he did an interview with Marvel. And of course I'd been gone for like 2.5 years at this point. That would have been super cool.
Definitely.
But yeah, no, pretty much everyone else, I think I got to meet most people.
And then what has been some of your favorite interactions at Marvel with superstars or wrestlers that you can share?
Diamond Dallas Page. We ended up, again, this is a Blake thing. We ended up connected with Diamond Dallas Page when he was starting to promote DDP Yoga. So basically, he came into Marvel and came on our podcast. It was one of the challenging ones where we're like, this guy doesn't know anything about comics, but we talked to him about wrestling and we talked to him about yoga. And it was we really hit it off with him. He sent me a bunch of free yoga DVDs. I was like, this is awesome. I kept in contact with him and I was like, this is a really good one. So he calls us one day and says, hey guys, I'm going to be in New York. I'm not going to be alone. He goes, I'm going to have Jake the Snake Roberts and Scott Hall with me. We're basically promoting this documentary we did, The Resurrection of Jake Roberts. And I want to bring them into the offices. And we're like, yeah, that sounds amazing. So he rolls up and unfortunately, like Jake Roberts, I don't know if he was shy or like what the deal was, but like Jake Roberts didn't show up. He stayed back at the hotel, but Scott Hall was there. This was cool because this was Scott Hall who had been living with DDP and Jake Roberts for a little while. So he was like, he was back, you know?
Yeah.
Like he was the guy I remember from when I was a kid as Razor Ramon or NWO Scott Hall. He was huge, just like larger than life, but just the nicest freaking guy. And again, I've had dozens and dozens of wrestlers came in, people from the past, people from the present. For some reason, this one stuck out to me because we just had this like awesome conversation with Scott Hall about his life, about wrestling, but more than anything, it was really about like how he turned his life around. And it was really touching. And when he passed a few months ago, that was, I mean, like, look, as a wrestling fan, you know that kind of the crappy thing is wrestlers die all the time.
Yeah.
So it's like we're constantly losing people. And, you know, a lot of wrestlers who I've met have passed away since I met him. But for some reason, the Scott Hall one hit me like really deeply because he was such a good guy and he was just so happy that he was turning his life around. That was really cool. I will also say that on a completely different spectrum, one of my all-time favorites was when AJ Lee came in. She came in twice. She was phenomenal. She was just like she came in to Marvel at like the height of her WWE career. She was in the middle of the deal with Punk, Kane, and Bryan.
Yeah.
She like wore the mask and like stepped down to the ring. Like she came in that week and she's ridiculous, huge comics fan. So we had such a fun time with her. Got like great pictures of her. And my favorite thing that she did was we had at Marvel, we had like replica Thor hammers. So they're Thor hammers. They're like, they're legit. They're heavy. So the guys who were with her, who were also like, I got to meet two of my good friends from Marvel, the PR guys there, Dave Sepperson. He was there and he's like, hey, can we get a picture of AJ holding Mjolnir? We're like, yeah, of course. Yeah, just have her pick it up. She goes to pick it up. And she's like, oh, this is really heavy. She's like, I'm not sure I can pick this up. And we're like, you're a wrestler. And she goes, guys, these muscles are for TV only. She's like, they don't really work. And I was like, that's hysterical. And then the one that frustrates me most, because I can't really in 2022 brag about it anymore because of what a scumbag he's turned out to be. But we had an awesome Hulk Hogan visit.
Ooh.
Like Hulk Hogan came in and it was freaking like, we had him record some stuff for us, like promoting different Marvel stuff. And I got to basically direct him, which was crazy. And it was really fun. But then like literally, I think his sex tape came out like a couple weeks later. And then obviously it just went downhill from there.
And you're like,
worse and worse and worse.
Could this really have come out at a better time?
So when people are like, what business do you really enjoy? I'm like, I'm not going to tell them that I enjoyed when Hulk Hogan came to visit us because he's a terrible person.
Right.
And that happened more often than I care to remember, unfortunately.
Let's dive into your current occupation. You are a visiting lecturer as well as the director at Rebel Media Group. What led you to Las Vegas and what made you want to dive into the world of education?
Yeah, it was kind of a left field thing. So what happened was I was going on 10 years at Marvel. Marvel was awesome. It was a dream job. It was everything I wanted to do, but it was also like crazy hours and just like a lot. It was a lot of work. Like working at Marvel is not easy. And my wife and I were having, well, she did most of the work, but we had our daughter. I was just like, there was something in my head where I was just like, I always tell people, I'm like, I got to do Marvel for 10 years. I got to do everything I wanted to do. So I have like no regrets, no like unchecked marks on the bucket list. So I was like, by the time I got to year 10, I was like, I think I want to do something else that will allow me to see my daughter grow up a little bit more. Like I just want, and honestly, it's probably like, there's a parallel to wrestling there. Like I know a lot of people are just like, they get to a certain age and they want to get off the road. And obviously my schedule was nowhere near like a wrestler schedule, but I was like, I want to do something else. And I want to do something that's going to allow me to be around for my daughter's childhood. My wife is from Las Vegas originally and had moved out to the East Coast in high school because her dad, who ran casinos, got a job working in Connecticut, then met me, for better or worse for her. And I ended up keeping her on the East Coast. Her entire family moved back here. Like her parents, her grandparents, her brother, they all gradually came back to Las Vegas. So she, in a perfect world, was like, especially with us starting a family, was like, I would like to be in Vegas near my family. But to her credit, she's like, as long as you want to work at Marvel, it's your dream job. I'm never going to take that away from you. We'll hang out. We'll stay in New Jersey. The minute I said, I was like, I think I might want to do something else. She was like, bam, like she was ready. She's like, all right, we're not living here anymore. And she had suffered through the East Coast winters for long enough.
Oh, yes.
So the deal was, we're like, all right, cool. I'm going to get a different job. We're going to move to Las Vegas. Like that's going to be our thing. We'll be around family and all that. The problem, which I probably don't need to impress upon you, is like, what do you do after you work at Marvel for 10 years? Like, what's the next
the next
step? And that was always something I was super concerned about because I was like, if I ever leave, I don't know what else I'm going to do. Like I've been working in comics since I was 22 years old. Like what's my skill set? And I looked at a lot of like digital media jobs, like basically PR, running websites. But I mean, it was like running websites for, 9-to-5 companies, like just didn't really excite me. And I was like, I don't want to work like a normal desk job. Like that just sounds terrible. So it was my brother-in-law who works at MGM. And I just said to him, I was like, what's going on in Vegas that I could be doing? And he goes, let me connect you with this guy, Clark Dumont. Clark was the chief of staff at MGM, which was like a weird role where he's connected everywhere across Las Vegas. Nicest guy you're ever going to meet. Still in touch with him to this day. But he is kind enough to take a phone call with me and basically says like, all right, what have you done like since you're in college? And I like ran down my resume and he goes, this is going to sound weird. He goes, but have you ever thought about teaching? And I said, no, absolutely not. I've never thought about it. Would you be opposed to it? Not necessarily. That actually sounds kind of interesting. I ran the internship program at Marvel, so I was always working with younger people. Everyone makes fun of me when I say this, but like I was a camp counselor when I was a teenager, and I say that like never leaves you. Like once a camp counselor, you're always ready to like jump in there with kids again. So I was like, all right, that sounds interesting. So he goes, all right. He goes, I'm close with the dean and the director over at UNLV at the School of Journalism. What I want to do is get you on the phone with them and see if they could find a place for you. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds amazing. So I talked to the dean and the director, my future bosses, and basically what they pitched to me, I'm pitching to them like, hey, you should hire me. I don't know why. They pitched to me, they're like, we're really into this idea of bringing in more professors who are not like traditional academics, who have actually like been out in the world getting practical experience. So you can come in and be like, instead of just saying like, here's this theory, I studied it in grad school, you can say like, all right, I worked in digital media for 10 years. Here's what you have to do in order to get this job. And I was like, that sounds awesome. And I came to Vegas, I lectured a class. It was probably the first time I was like, hi, my name's Ben. I work at Marvel, which became like my catchphrase. There was an excitement in that class. There was an excitement. I'm not lying when I say that I was as excited about the potential for this as I had been 10 years earlier to start working at Marvel. Because I was like, this is something new. It's something cool. It's another chapter for me. Because I could have stayed at Marvel and kept doing the same things, and it would have been awesome. I would have had a blast. I always had a blast. But getting to do something new and different. And my boss, John, the guy who worked at WWE, gave me this great piece of advice where he said, as long as you're at Marvel, you're going to be one of 2 dozen people who are kind of doing the same thing. He goes, the minute you go somewhere else, you're going to be the only one who used to work at Marvel. And that's going to be really cool. He's like, it's going to help you a lot. And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And when I got to UNLV, I started to realize that was definitely the case. But yeah, they brought me in as a visiting lecturer, had me teaching social media, marketing, PR, and had me start Rebel Media Group, which the idea was basically a student-staffed digital media agency where they get to work on, social media campaigns for real clients, and I supervise them. It's both my favorite and least favorite thing in the world. But then a couple semesters in, and this is how you and I initially met, was they had someone else teaching the podcasting class.
Okay, so they did have someone else teaching it. Okay.
They had someone else teaching the podcasting class, and I don't think it was going very well. And they said, hey, didn't you used to podcast when you were at Marvel? And I was like, yeah, I used to podcast when I was at Marvel. They're like, do you want to teach podcasting? And my initial reaction was no. I was like, that sounds terrible. I was like, how do you teach podcasting? I'm like, how do you find enough stuff to do for a full semester?
Right.
But I came up with this idea. I don't remember why. I came up with this idea that it was all right, well, every week is going to be listen to a podcast, discuss a podcast, and then we have a guest in who is a podcaster who these guys get to interview. And like, that's going to be what drives the class. And they're going to be working on podcasts, but really like that idea of having like a guest speaker every week, but not making it like a traditional guest speaker where they come and like give a PowerPoint. More, this person's coming in, I'm going to interview them, then the class is going to interview them. And it's like, it's a podcast. So that was how I ended up doing podcasting. But yeah, there was someone doing it before me. I'm not going to mention who it is because I don't think it was, I've heard from other students like it wasn't the best class before then, but it's turned out to be a pretty popular class. And now I teach podcasting and the introduction to digital and social media. And that's how I ended up going from Marvel to teaching in a weird way.
Speaking of the podcasting class, you have been able to bring in notable individuals within the wrestling community who have made a name for themselves in podcasting, including Renee Paquette, formerly known as Renee Young in WWE, and Emilio Sparks, the producer of Renee's Oral Sessions, among other wrestling-related podcasts. How were you able to foster these relationships, and what was the reception like of having these individuals speak to your classes?
The thing I always say was be nice to everybody you meet, no matter where you are, because you never know when you might need to want to call in a favor later on. I met so many people when I was at Marvel, and I tried to always be like the nicest person I could be, but also like, hey, if I can do anything for you, like just let me know. And there are a lot of people in a lot of different areas who to this day, and I'm not bragging by saying this, if I ask them for a favor, they'll help me out because I have a good relationship with them. When I was coming to Vegas and I knew that Renee lived here at the time, I was like, oh, that would be a really cool, actually, it was my wife who suggested it. She said, you should get Renee to come in and do a class because she can come in and be there live. And I asked her about it and she was gung-ho for it. I've had people from SportsCenter. I've had people from Marvel, obviously. I had Paul Scheer, who's a comedian who does How Did This Get Made? These are all just people who I met randomly during my 10 years at Marvel. And I had just like kept up a good relationship with that. Like, even if it was just like, very casual, on Twitter once in a while. Also, not going to lie, having the verified account on Twitter helps a lot. It makes people stand up and take notice of you pretty regularly.
Right.
But using these connections that I've had before, like Renee had come into the office, we had a great time. We'd stayed in touch with each other. When I was moving out to Vegas, she was like, "Oh my God, let me know when you get here." So it was cool to have her in for the class. She was probably like the biggest name we had, I would say. But all these other people I had along the way are just like, I have like a true crime guy, and I have like I said, a sports guy. Like, I have all these people who are just like, reasonably big names who I just met when I was at Marvel, and who I was just cool to, and who I just like stayed in contact with. I'll never forget when I put out the syllabus the first semester and people saw Renee's name on the syllabus. There were wrestling fans in the class, and they freaked out. They were like, "Is this real? Is this real? This is going to happen?" I was like, "Yes." I was like, "She's coming in." And I know you came into that class.
Yep.
You weren't in the class.
Nope.
You came into the class. And sometimes that would happen when we had big names come in. But it was, it's honestly like the lesson to be learned here is be nice to everybody, because you never know when you're going to want to call in a favor. And if you're nice to everybody, they're going to want to do that favor. The other thing I'll say is that, and I say this to my students when they like reach out for assignments and stuff, I'm like, anyone in podcasting, if you tell them that you're involved in a college class teaching podcasting and you want to do like an interview with them, or you want to have them as a guest speaker, they will jump at the chance to do it, because they're like, "Oh man, this would have been so cool, when I was in college."
Right.
That's what I get a lot. But also just like one of my friends who comes on every semester is Art Ocal. Used to be Kyle Edwards with WWE. He's on Sports Center now. And he says straight up to the students, he goes, "Listen," he goes, "if any of you ever have any questions, reach out to me." He goes, "Because here's the secret about everyone working in media. We love to talk about ourselves. And if you're going to give us an opportunity to do so, and you're telling us it's going to be for a class or for a paper or something, like, we will always say yes." And that's kind of a lesson there.
What has been the overall reception of the students enrolled in your podcasting classes? Have they liked it? Have there been any like feedback on your end that you think, "Oh, okay, maybe I can change the class to flow this way or that way"?
The most common thing I got at the beginning, I made it very much, in academic terms, it was very much a theory class. There's a lot of like just talking about stuff and not really, those first several semesters, there's a lot of talking about stuff and not really doing stuff. The lesson I learned was these guys wanted more chances to actually record themselves, go into the studio, learn the technical side. So like I had a good reception the first couple semesters. People liked the class. They gave me very high reviews and stuff like that. But there was very much room for improvement. And whereas there were not a lot of audio assignments those first couple semesters, now I have audio assignments every couple weeks. And I also make sure that in addition to having people who are just hosts come on, I have engineers, I have producers. Like, I just like varied it up a little bit more. I'm like, all right, so having 12 guests who are all hosts is not really giving people a full view of what podcasting is. If I have 6 hosts, 2 producers, some sound guys, some editing guys, even like I'll talk about stuff like graphics. Like, as you know, like graphics is a huge important part of podcasting. And that's what I think has improved from like first 2 semesters to today, is it's a much more well-rounded class, both in terms of you'll get to do a lot more audio assignments, but also you'll get to talk to people who are versed in things besides just, well, I'm the person who's talking when the microphone goes on. That's definitely been the reception. It's like, look, there have been students who have flat out told me like, "Hey, you need to improve this." Like, it's not been unanimous, like everything is great, sunshine and, flowers all the time. No, there've been students who have said like, "Hey, your class was good, but I wish we got to record more." Or, flat out, just like I didn't get what I wanted out of this class because I wanted to learn how to do a podcast. And instead, we just talked about other people's podcasts and I never got to do a podcast. So I take that to heart. It's the same thing that even when I do my other class, my digital media class, the eternal struggle for me is that because I'm not like an academic and I'm not a traditional teacher, I've never gotten good at making like PowerPoints and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I generally tend to just kind of like talk off the cuff and have conversations.
Right.
And some students love that and some students hate that. So I'll always get feedback being like, hey, you should do more PowerPoints, or like you should do more traditional lectures as opposed to conversations. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like a lot of who I am as a teacher is that conversational nature. And that's going to be kind of like what you get from one of my classes. For the most part, it's worked out pretty well, but you can design the best class in the world. It's still not going to be for everybody.
You're
like,
right.
There's definitely going to be like criticism, and a lot of those will help me though. So I'm not upset about it.
What is your advice to someone who may be looking to start a podcast but is hesitant because of the oversaturation of the podcasting market currently?
2 suggestions. 1, think long and hard about what makes you different and unique from anybody else who is going to do a podcast. It can be a small thing. Like if I want to do a comic book podcast, it's definitely going to be trading heavily on the fact that I was like inside the comic book industry for 10 years, because not everyone can do that. Like, look, you're a great example. Like when you guys started out and the gimmick was kind of like, hey, we're going to talk about wrestling, but we're also going to talk about wine. I was like, genius, because nobody else is doing that.
Right.
And then the thing is, you have that high concept to start, the thing that like separates you to start. Once you're a year, and you can speak to this, like once you're a year, 2 years into it, you can do whatever you want. Like you don't have to be married to your gimmick. Like you can also just have conversations, because at this point you have an audience that you built by being unique. Now they're here for you and you can do a lot of different things. The other piece of advice I would say is just do it. Just friggin' record yourself, put something out there. First episode's going to be bad. Prepare for that. First 3 episodes might be bad, but just keep going, just like do the thing. It's like people used to ask when I was at Marvel, they're like, how do I break into comics? And the answer was always make a comic. It's not complicated. Write a comic, draw a comic, do whatever you want to do, get it out there. It's going to be so much easier once you have the first one out there. And like, you can just be like, all right, well, that was my first effort. Wasn't great, but it's out there. And once you do that, like it's going to be hard to stop you.
Have you had any students in your class who formulated that podcast of their choice? Because I know you had that assignment where they kind of went through and they created their own podcast. Mm-hmm. They had a guest host. Has there been anyone that has started after the class, like just kept going with the podcast that you know of? Oh, really?
Many. Yeah, definitely. Many have. I couldn't even name all of them for you. I would say 1 to 2 every semester.
Oh, good.
So I've got usually I have anywhere between 4 to 8 groups. Mm-hmm. Depending on when I started the class, I was 20 people, and then a lot of people wanted to take the class. So they're like, hey, will you let more people in? I was like, okay. Because more people is, more grading.
Right.
But there have been a bunch. There have been also some that I'm like, I wish you guys would have gone on, because I think you have something really special here. And that's why I always try to, in my feedback, if I think they have potential to do something, I always try to be encouraging of I think you guys should keep this up. But yeah, there's 1 or 2 every semester that keep going. There have been a handful that, a lot of those will keep going and then they're done after a year or something. But there's a handful that have kept going, pretty permanently. Daniel Agboya, who was my TA for my first several semesters, and he was my unofficial TA because it's not a grad class, so you don't get a TA. And Daniel basically was one of my students from one of my other classes, says, I love podcasting. I'm going to come TA your class. I'm like, okay. He came in and did it. To this day, he runs a podcast network of video game podcasts. But there's been other stuff like that. There's been little success stories. There's a few that are on KUND at the UNLV radio station. There was these guys who were doing a thing about music in movie soundtracks. I know they kept going.
Uh-huh.
And I was a guest on their show, and that was really fun. There's another one called the Brunch Club, who it's just a bunch of girls and one guy getting together talking about whatever. They're pretty fun, and they're, I think, going into their 3rd season. Obviously, you weren't in my class, but you did come to one of my classes, and you're going on several years now. So I chalk that one up as a success for me, even though it probably doesn't count. But yeah, there's been some really good ones that have come out of it.
I think I do count because I feel like if I wouldn't have met Renee in that class, probably still would have done the podcast because we had everything laid out. But that experience truly made an impact on me. And it's something that I'll never forget. And I'm sure a lot of your students in your classes, they've met different individuals that you've brought in and they felt the same way. It's just to be able to speak to these people who have had these podcasts, they've had these experiences. It really is cool as like a student, especially a college student, to have that experience. So I think it's great that you do that.
It's nice to hear that. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben, for joining me today on Wrestling Winedown. Where can the people find you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at Ben J Morse, Morse, like Morse code. And then I have a personal Instagram that I don't give out, but I also have a Instagram where I just post comic book art called Ben Likes Comics. It's gotten up to like 700 followers, and I'm like, this is great. I'm just happy. I would be happy with 20. So that's out there. And then just find me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm definitely around, and I love talking to people.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Wrestling Winedown. You can find all of our other episodes available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you listen to your podcast. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at WWDCAST. Let us know what you thought about the episode. What was your favorite part? Until next time, enjoy your wine and, of course, enjoy your wrestling. Cheers!